I'm really delighted. We at the steering circle came up with a thought a couple months ago that it would be great to encourage our participants. I don't say members because we don't have a formal membership, but our participants to prepare papers, or if they have already prepared short papers that are broadly consistent with the HPAC mission, that we would take a look at them and host them on our website and build up hopefully a library of papers reflecting various views. And as you all know, we've received two wonderful short papers from the two Roberts, Robert Chris and Robert Tulip. So we decided to basically turn over the rest of the meeting to the two of you to briefly present your papers, engage in conversation among between the two of you, and then open it up to the rest of us however you would like. We usually go till the top of the next hour for those who can stay. So unless there's anything else urgent, I'm simply going to first thank both Roberts for the papers you've written. They're really provocative, and turn the meeting over to the two of you.
Thank you very much, Herb. And I've really welcomed the opportunity to get to know Robert Chris as a really deep thinker on climate. And I think his book is a few years ago now is really a very important contribution to the philosophy around climate change. And both of us do have a background in philosophy. Now, Robert, I'm happy to present first, but if you'd like to present first, you'd be welcome.
No, you go ahead. I'll follow you because then I'll know what I'm supposed to do.
Okay, what I'm going to do is share my screen, and I will present a PowerPoint, which I hope you can see there, which I just want to go through the paper on moral perspectives on climate policy that HPAC has kindly published, if that's not too strong a word. So the key arguments that I present there are that the mainstream climate action movement wrongly sees emission reduction as the primary strategy to address global warming. And in fact, cutting emissions can only have a marginal effect on the climate. And so there's a moral case to reduce warming by enhancing planetary albedo. I wanted to quickly show a couple of slides that I presented previously. This is one from the recently late Will Steffen's wonderful essay on the trajectories of the Earth system in the Anthropocene. And the problem is that business as usual is threatening to take us over the precipice into a hothouse Earth. And if we look at what we can do to address that, emission reduction can only bend that needle slightly, and greenhouse gas removal a bit more. In order to get to a stabilized Earth, we need to enhance albedo and brighten the planet. I found this a really useful chart. What it shows is that I'm going to take advantage of the fact that on Zoom I can use a laser pointer. This flat line is where we want to be with net zero heating. All of these factors are what is heating up the planet, increasing radiative forcing, and these are the factors that are cutting radiative forcing. What we need to do to have climate stability is that these factors below the line, aerosols, volcanoes, and so on, need to equal these factors. At the moment, we've got this red line, which is the marker of radiative forcing and the warming. What we need to do is bend that red line back down to zero. Now, changing this, the CO2, this big grey area, back down to zero is going to be really tough. It's a lot easier for us to increase the cooling side of the ledger. And so just moving on, I just thought this is one I've discussed with John Nissen. This blue line shows the potential of stratospheric aerosol injection, theoretically, to cut temperature back and down to zero by adding roughly 15 or 20, 25 megatons of sulfur dioxide. Now that's the theory, and we all know that there's a lot of debate about that. And this is a chart that I produced just to show this is the committed warming from past emissions. This is what we're adding per year. That's the effect of Paris, and that means that by 2030 we'll still be adding roughly 16 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere per year under Paris. So it's an illustration of the failure of current policy. And now, in my paper on the moral perspectives on climate policy, I quoted Greta Thunberg from her climate book, saying all geoengineering schemes are attempts to manipulate the Earth with the same domineering mindset that got us into the climate crisis in the first place. And the counter-argument that we need to enhance albedo for human flourishing and to protect biodiversity. So we've been having a bit of a email conversation over the last week about whether working for a brighter planet actually does oppose a domineering mindset. And I would submit that, in fact, it does, that albedo enhancement is something that should be supported by people who have a spiritual approach to our planet, caring for Mother Earth as sacred, a Gaian spirituality. And so that albedo enhancement as a broad concept is something that can ally with Indigenous communities. So now I can't see the top of my screen, unfortunately, with my Zoom, but the point here is that enhancing planetary albedo through the broad suite of solar radiation management activities could mitigate serious climate risks, and those include sea level rise and biodiversity loss, extreme weather, and other systemic instabilities. And limiting these effects of warming would prevent avoidable suffering and enhance planetary security and stability. So placing the climate analysis in that global thinking context of security, stability, and also suffering. And the opponents of new brightening technologies appear not to have thought this moral balance through, that if you have a method that can prevent biodiversity loss, there hasn't been that much analysis on this, but for example, the polewood drift problem that we're seeing from climate change is something that can be mitigated by albedo enhancement. So some of the key points: that action to cut greenhouse gases can't affect temperature or weather for decades. Preventing global warming by carbon-based methods alone isn't feasible on a climate-relevant timescale. And brightening the planet, for example, by refreezing the poles, could have rapid effects to reduce weather extremes. Global governance systems for climate technology could minimize risk and bring benefits for prosperity and peace. Without higher albedo, tipping points are expected to be breached quickly, with serious social, economic, and environmental damage. Methane from permafrost tipping points alone could swamp greenhouse gas cuts, and the real alternatives are either brightening the planet or accepting global warming. So let's see, where are we? I'll just check that right. My screen is not advancing. There we are. And so this idea that opposing brightening allows warming is a reasoned scientific critique of some widely accepted ideas in the IPCC literature and among NGO communities. So doing nothing to reverse the current loss of planetary albedo fails our duty of care to our common future. Now, cutting greenhouse gases is expensive, it's slow, it's difficult, and it faces powerful opposition. So together with the technical challenges, the political and economic challenges make emission reduction impractical and risky on the climate-relevant timescale and physical scale created by the need to mitigate the likelihood of tipping points. And by contrast, there's available methods to brighten the planet. I particularly like marine cloud brightening and mirrors to enhance Earth's reflectivity. And they could be deployed quickly with high cooling return on investment while other technologies, and I'm thinking especially of stratospheric aerosol injection, I think need more study before deployment. But I do believe that marine cloud brightening is something that especially should be deployed rapidly. Now, it's widely agreed that brightening the planet can't substitute for cutting greenhouse gases, and we see that especially with the ocean acidification problem. But that's only a long-term thing. And the short-term problem is actually the reverse. Cutting greenhouse gases can't substitute for brightening the planet. So the IPCC priorities have to be reversed. So the first priority should be to brighten the planet, albedo enhancement. The second priority should be converting carbon dioxide into useful products. That's what I see as a better way of pitching the carbon dioxide removal agenda. My hope is that rather than geosequestration of greenhouse gases, that products like soil and roads and just large-scale carbon fixation that has got economic value will emerge as something on a climate relevant gigaton scale. And then a bit more slowly, I think we can take more time to transform the energy sector, because I feel that the headlong rush to just put all of our eggs in the basket of transforming the energy sector, it's not going to stop global warming, and it's going to create it's not the best way to achieve the issues. Now, so good governance of all of this is absolutely essential. We need an international organization which is tasked to safely increase planetary albedo, and looking at how we can assess and deploy climate technology with transparent, inclusive approaches as a forum for practical agreement on how to proceed. The agenda is to build confidence and stability and security. And I really hope that the first thing that we can focus on is to refreeze the poles. Now, dialogue on ethical beliefs is central to these sorts of issues, social legitimacy, political mandates. And it's possible to change policy quickly when leaders are convinced that ideas that previously were seen as morally good are actually deficient, and that ideas they'd been taught to fear are actually safe and necessary. And I'm placing that in the context of the debate around methods to address climate change. So ideological opposition to brightening the planet has got a range of errors, and especially the dire consequences of failure to act in time, looking at tipping points in particular. So we need to shift our climate goal from net zero emissions to net zero heating, balancing the warming effects with equal and opposite cooling effects. There's a lot of complacency, a lot of confusion about these moral issues. It's allowing inaction while the climate worsens, and the high risk of dangerous tipping points continues to grow. So to conclude, emission reduction is not enough, and we need to brighten the planet. Thank you.
Great, good. Do you want to take questions, or shall I go straight on?
Please go straight on, Robert.
Okay, fine. Well, obviously, a lot of what I want to say you've just said, because to a large measure we're in agreement. But I'm going to work on the assumption that nobody has read, or few of people, there will be a sufficient number of people here that haven't read what I've written that's on the website. And also, Suzanne, I've got to tell you, I've made some further changes to it because I found a couple of mistakes. So I'm going to send those to you shortly. But I'm going to run through very quickly what the paper says and where it's coming from. Then I want to touch on some of the geopolitical issues that Robert's just mentioned. And then I want to talk about how I got to the conclusions that I got to and what sort of the ideas in which they're rooted. But first, let me say that I'm probably deservedly getting a bit of a reputation of being a miserable sod and being very negative about the way that this whole piece is going to unfold. And the truth of the matter is that I am very negative. And I'm constantly looking for good reasons to be cheerful, and I'm constantly being disappointed. And maybe by the time I finish talking, you'll all want to go and slit your wrists as well. But that's a risk I'm going to have to take. So the paper, let me just run through quickly what the paper's saying. Essentially, it says that the UNFCCC process has failed. We all know that. It started in the late 80s, early 90s. And since then, rather than reducing emissions, they've increased by more than 70%. And greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere have also spiraled. So the whole exercise may have raised awareness, but in terms of action, been a disaster. And from the outset, the process has been focused on reducing emissions. And I just want to repeat a quote. He cut two very short words from the UNFCCC constitution, where it declares its mission to be to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. That it declares is its, quote, ultimate objective, to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. Well, it's not doing a very good job so far. And there's a whole kind of philosophical background to this. It's rooted very much in the kind of reductionist, Cartesian, Baconian mindset that that we've got this problem because we've been emitting all these greenhouse gases, and in order to solve the problem, oh well, we just do the reverse. We just take the greenhouse gases away. But of course, as I will try and explain towards the end of this little presentation, things don't quite work out like that in complex systems. Because it's not linear and it's not even non-linear, it's actually chaotic. And that creates some very serious problems. So the other thing that I just want to highlight from the past is that when the first assessment report was published in 1990, obviously the level of detail that was then available was very much less than it is today. A huge amount of real quality research has been done in the last 30 years. That wasn't available to those guys back in the late 80s. But they understood the basic direction of travel, that we needed to reduce emissions. And their recipe for a happy outcome was that we should reduce our annual emissions to the same level they had been in 1985, in other words, 5 years earlier at the time. And that entailed reducing annual emissions by 10 gigatons of CO2 per year by the middle of the coming century, in other words, by about 2050. So their target was reduce emissions by 10 gigatons of CO2 per year, and you've got 60 years to do it. Well, here we are now, planning to get to net zero, not even really zero, but net zero, and that involves reducing 40 gigatons, in other words, 4 times as much, and we've now got less than 30 years to do it. So it's more than 8 times the problem that it was then, totally as a consequence of a lack of decisive action in the meantime. And some years ago, I was quite seriously ill, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And one of the questions that kept coming to me whilst I was feeling sorry for myself was, look, the last 30 years have been a total disaster in climate policy. Why should we believe that the next 30 years are going to be any different? And I am yet to find a positive answer to that question. And I'm hoping that somebody else is going to be able to help me find it. But at the moment, I don't know where it is. So the position that I've taken really until very recently was that we really needed to focus on emissions reductions. And when I was doing my PhD back in the late noughties and early 10s, that's 2010, not 1910. I then recognized, this was in the early days when SRM and greenhouse gas removal were very much regarded as being in the geoengineering package. It was seen as one activity, which of course it's long since changed. I very much took the view then that any effort, any attempt to do stratospheric aerosol injection, because that was the only game in town at the time when it came to albedo enhancement, any attempt to do that, A, would be a disaster, and B, it would never happen anyway, because geopolitically, it was just an impossible thing to make happen, except in the most dire circumstances when everything else had failed. And then it would be undertaken in a panic at the last minute without adequate research, and because we'd run out of other options. And I very much regret to say that that seems to me to be exactly the direction that we're traveling in. And I see nothing to change those insights that I had all those years ago. So what's new and what has really changed my view in recent months really has been the Hansen warming in the pipeline paper, the updated work by Lenton and others on tipping points, and I think a general recognition that the politics of climate change really are just not making things happen at the scale and at the speed that's necessary. And so cooling the planet now, rather than being a useful addition to the armory of responses, has now become the critical tool. It now become, exactly as Robert was saying, the thing that we have to do immediately, the most urgent thing. And that is a change in my own position that has happened quite dramatically I would think in the last 3 to 4 months. And I've become totally converted to this cause as a consequence. I won't go through now the numbers and the detail, because I think that they are, we can talk about those more, but the Hansen figures do indicate 3 critical things which I think are worth highlighting, the changes that have occurred in his paper. First of all, that the amount of warming in the pipeline is considerably greater than previously thought. Secondly, that the climate response time, in other words, the time lag between the changes in the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations and the consequent changes in surface temperature are very much longer than previously thought. And thirdly, that the cooling impact, the contrary cooling impact of the aerosols that are emitted alongside the fossil fuel emissions has been very much greater than previously thought. So when you put these 3 things together, the situation is dramatically more precarious than was previously imagined. And it makes even the statements in AR6 already seriously out of date. And that is a major concern. So that's essentially where the science, and that's largely what my paper says. I don't think there's much else I want to say about that. It just really emphasizes those points. I'm just quickly scanning through it. And that's really the issue. I make one comment here that and I'll just add to this, and that is that it is essentially albedo enhancement is not on the political agenda. It was not discussed in any significant sense at COP27, and hasn't been at any of the previous COPs. Even greenhouse gas removal only really emerged in the 2014, and then somewhat grudgingly, and then only focused on BECCS, on bioenergy and climate carbon capture and storage, which was always a ridiculous idea because you can never do it at the scale necessary without depriving most of the world of the food that they require. So these alternatives have not been adequately addressed. And even in, I think it was this month or last month, I can't remember, I think it was actually just a few days ago, that that UNEP issued its report on geoengineering. And it's the same old, same old. It's all about the fact that it's very risky, we don't know very much, and we really need to focus on the things that we know about, which is reducing emissions and doing a bit of greenhouse gas removal. So at the highest level, albedo enhancement in whatever form is simply not being discussed in the corridors of power. And so we might well be very enthusiastic about it, and we might see it as being our sole source of salvation. But until it gets onto the agenda and actually gets discussed, there is no chance of making any progress here. So this brings me to my other main thread, which is the geopolitics of this. And this is really, I suppose, one of the reasons why I am so negative about the prospects of a smooth landing. The global warming, the catch for it, the catch is in the word global. You know, it is what it says on the tin. It's global. It affects everybody. It doesn't affect everybody equally, but it does affect everybody. And this is probably the first time in human history that there's ever been an issue which has affected the entire global population simultaneously. Not even the world wars did that. Not even the Black Death did that. So this is really a unique experience in human history. And what we are discovering is that we are simply not equipped to deal with it. We don't have the tools, we don't have the experience, we haven't been here before. So we're inventing it on the fly. And so far, we're not doing a very good job of it. So when you look around the world today, we're all sitting here getting very excited about the issues of global warming and climate change. But what's going on out there? We've got, heightened tensions between Russia and well, there's a war going on with Russia and Ukraine. heightened tensions between the West and the US in particular, and Russia and China. All sorts of really big geopolitical moves, which pay no attention whatsoever to any of the concerns that we've got. They're just going on in the background, and they're not in the slightest bit asking themselves, oh, do you think it would be a good idea to kind of have a truce for a while and get this climate change thing sorted, and then we can go back to business as usual and fight each other? Not at all. They're kind of following the same old tropes of the centuries, doing what they do. And there is no, I look for evidence of where things are actually happening. Where are the actions, not the decisions, not the statements, not the rhetoric, but the actual things that are happening at scale, and it isn't anywhere. Even the US IRA, which is a huge sum of money, when you look at it, when I've looked at it, and I have to say I haven't spent a vast amount of time looking at it, it's a fantastic effort, but it isn't global. It's very local, and it doesn't pull many of the levers that are essential to getting the solutions or the management approaches to climate change that are necessary. So the geopolitics of climate change I see as being very, very fraught. We are locked into this crippled and totally ineffective UNFCCC process, and it's impossible, I think, now to imagine an alternative structure being put in place that is more effective, or for that to change for all sorts of reasons that we can perhaps discuss later. So the geopolitics of this I see as being the reason that all of our great ideas and all of the enthusiasm and all of our concern being simply set aside and trodden on and ignored, because those that have the power to make the things happen that need to happen are not listening, and they're not going to listen. So that's the issue. So let me just finish by just talking briefly about my perspective on where I come from all of this. So some of you already know that I keep talking about complex adaptive systems. And complex adaptive systems was something I discovered about 15 years ago when I was researching for my PhD. And I had this luxury of just reading stuff and being curious about things. And I just chanced upon this work. And it was a total revelation. And it has changed my attitude to almost every domain of my life. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about complex adaptive systems theory to give you some sense of where I'm coming from. So there are a very large number of systems, and humanity, the ecosystem, are examples of this, which are self-regulating, they're self-sustaining. The members, the components of the systems work together to sustain and to continue the operation. Just think of a company, any business, they do that. People come together, they have a project. The business, it has an existence that transitions even when the people in the business change. So it goes from generation to generation. Employees come and go, but the business stays. So that business kind of self-sustains in its own way. Now these entities that are self-sustaining have certain properties, certain elements that they have in common, and whether they are companies or ecosystems or animals or whatever they may be. There are lots of examples of this. So the first thing is just to understand what a system is. What makes a vibrant system? They have to have a couple of key qualities. One is there needs to be a large number of members in it. Lots of people. You don't get a sustaining system with 10 things in it. They've got to be big, lots of things. Those things have to be diverse, lots of diversity. So if you get 10 people in a room and they've all got the same opinion, you're not going to get anything. It's not going to be self-sustaining, because sooner or later it's going to shoot itself in the foot, because it's not listening to all of the other issues that are going on. So diversity is really critical. The freedom to interact, the people or the elements that are in the system have to be able to interact with each other to generate stuff, because what moves a complex system forward are all the emergent properties that come from the interactions between the elements. So when those people sit in a room and they have a discussion, just like we're doing now, ideas emerge. some of those ideas are rubbish, and some of those ideas are sheer genius. And then there is this process that is this process of what's called autonomous selection that selects out the ideas that are rubbish and it discards them, and it selects out the ideas that are brilliant and it enhances them and replicates them. And the paradigmatic example of this process is what we would all understand by evolution, that happens over very long time scales, and that's essentially what happens in that process. So you think of evolution as being a very good example of the way that a complex adaptive system works randomly. This is not thought through, it's not designed, it just kind of happens. And that's a critical point. It's not designed. A committee didn't get into a room and say, right, this is how the world is going to be. They might actually do that, but whatever they say that the world is going to be, you can guarantee that that's not the way the world is going to be, because other influences are going to come in and change it. So that's what constitutes a complex adaptive system. Now, the critical properties of these systems, and this is the last bit I'm going to talk about, they have three properties: potential, interconnectedness, and resilience. And they have an adaptive cycle, a lifetime, if you like, a life cycle through which they go. So the systems start off from some beginning when they're small. A company is set up, there's two people in a room working out what they're going to do, and it grows and it grows and it gets stronger and it acquires assets and it builds up its capacity and it creates stuff. And then it creates a lot of potential, and the interconnectedness that has enabled those elements to come together to generate those emergent properties that have become part of that potential, that becomes very great. And eventually what happens is that the members of the system that are really benefiting from these assets and the potential want to hold on to it because it becomes very, very valuable. And in many cases, what emerges through time is a very powerful elite who have a disproportionate share of the wealth, the assets, and so on. And they then exert their power to retain control of what they've got, rather than encouraging the flexibility and the interconnections within the system that have enabled it to grow. Because if they were to do that, they might sacrifice or might be obliged to sacrifice some of what they have acquired over time. Now, eventually, that interconnectedness that has been the source of flexibility and production and creativity, it ossifies, it rigidifies, and the system becomes increasingly less well able to adapt to external influences. In effect, what happens is that its resilience begins to wane. And eventually, the system becomes an accident waiting to happen, that some external event will occur that the system simply can't cope with. The floods that were at 2 or 3 meters for 1,000 years, suddenly one comes along, it's 100 meters. We weren't expecting that. We're not prepared for that. And it wipes us out. So it is that lack of resilience that eventually means that something will happen and the system will fall over. It will collapse. And when it collapses, just as I was explaining in the email the other day about the tarot card, the death card, it's not the end of the world, it's just the end of that system in its current form. It collapses, its potential is rendered asunder, it all falls to pieces, and then it begins again. And humanity particularly has got this indomitable spirit. You know, we are builders. That's our nature. So when it all collapses, we'll start again. We'll pick ourselves up, we'll dust ourselves down, and we'll start all over again, as we have done countless times in the past. So I don't see the collapse as being, the end. I see it as being a new beginning. So where I'm at now, just to finish this off, is that my expectation is, and I have to say, I think it probably is a kind of a confident expectation in a rather macabre way, is that we are headed to that kind of singularity. We are headed to one of those very, very infrequent things that happens on a centennial or even millennial timescale. One of those very infrequent events where the system, civilization as we know it, is going to collapse. And it's going to collapse under the weight of all the things that we've talked about, because we have lost the capacity to adapt the changes that are occurring around us. And in that situation, there is only one way forward, and the timing is uncertain, and the precise nature of the collapse is uncertain, and what follows it is uncertain. But the adaptive cycle will continue, and something new will be generated, and others will be there to rebuild. So that's my little story in a nutshell. I don't know how long I've been going on, 10, 15 minutes, but that's where I'm at.
I'm going to jump in, Robert, and say I agree with, I'd say, 90%, but let's just tease out some of this 10% where we might differ. And it's essentially on, is the collapse necessary? And my view is no, it's not. I think we have the capacity to evolve into global thinking, to change our civilization in order to adapt to the problems of climate change. And so I'll go back. Both of us have a philosophical background, and you mentioned Francis Bacon. And not everyone might be familiar with him. He was the founder of what's called the inductive method of science. And so back in the 1600s, he challenged the old Aristotle scholastic method by saying, empirical facts are what we need to focus on. And so you, in your talk, you criticised Bacon and also Descartes. My sense is that what we're doing with talking about albedo enhancement actually is a direct application of the Baconian inductive method, and so it's, rather than saying that scientific method is wrong, the problem is that people are simply not applying it. And what we need to do now is to apply the scientific method, and but what is needed is the combination of that scientific method with I suppose, a broader philosophy, because I get where you're coming from in criticizing Bacon, because he was there's a strong connection between empiricism and imperialism. That is, that the British empiricists used measurement in order to conquer and suppress people around the world. And Mike McCracken has referred just in an email just today to how the Pope validated that sort of imperialism. So we've got this connection between science and empire, which is, I think, quite defective in the way that you've been describing in your comment about complex adaptive systems. And so challenging us to tell a new story, to find new thinking that respects other ways of thinking, but also respects what is vital and good within the scientific and capitalist tradition. Because if we don't retain what is adaptive within those traditions, then the sort of collapse that you're talking about is inevitable. So you're welcome to respond, Robert, and I also invite everybody else to put your hand up using the hands up function at the bottom of the screen and join the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to kind of come back on one point. I mean, I am not discarding the Bacon Cartesian approach, that's a reductionist approach to these things. For God's sake, it has been hugely influential in the developments of the industrial era and the way that science and technology has advanced over the last 300-400 years. So it would be foolish to kind of say, that it's there is something fundamentally wrong about it. I think what I'm saying is it's fundamentally incomplete. So it's good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. And it's all very well to say that the scientific method has developed these ideas, albedo enhancement, for example, and the issue is simply we've got to get people to kind of buy into it. The problem is precisely that, getting the people to buy into it, and that's the challenge. That's the non-linearity. That's the chaotic part of it all. One of the things that has been clear to me throughout my time, the 20 years now that I've been thinking about climate change, is that there has never been a time, and it's true today, there has never been a time when we did not have at our disposal the ready means to address the threats of climate change. That's always been the case. The problem has always been our lack of capacity to develop and to deploy those in a coherent fashion. The problems with responding to climate change have got almost nothing to do with the science or the technology. We've got great scientists, great technologists and engineers. That's not the issue. The issue is the will to act and taking the people along with us, and all of the other things that get in the way, the COVIDs and the wars and the other stuff that interferes. And that's the problem. That is what is holding us back. And the thing is that if you look at the current world, the post-World War II international liberal order, as we call it, that only really occurred because of the chaos and destruction of the two world wars. It wouldn't have happened if those wars hadn't have happened. So the chaos and the collapse has to be seen for what it is, but not forgetting the fact that from it usually comes something of great value that would not arise were it not for that collapse, because the collapse is a releasing mechanism. It's a catharsis that's necessary. Lots of hands up.
Yep. Thanks, Robert. So what we'll do is we'll just take each person in turn, and if we need to engage in dialogue, we'll do that. But otherwise, we'll just go through. So firstly, John Nissen.
Yeah, I have to be a bit more optimistic than Robert, Chris. The thing that people realise now that there is a real climate crisis. They haven't really registered that. The general population hadn't registered that until we got all these amazing extremes of things, and they can also see that the Arctic is melting down. We get David Attenborough documentaries and so on. And then George Soros talks to a security conference, and behind the scenes he's been talking to Sir David King, and he comes up with the huge security issue. Is this global warming, and our start to tackle this has to be refreezing the Arctic. So there's the making of a social tipping point where people realize that something drastic has to be done in the short term to deal with these increasing extremes of weather, and which are liable to become climate extremes. If you get the same extreme of weather several years running, effectively you've got you're facing a new climate, and that's really worrying people in parts of the US. So I'm determinedly optimistic. I'm determined to be optimistic about the future, because I think if we're not, we won't persuade anybody. We've got to show that there is a way forward. We can reverse the weather extremes, and it costs very little. It has no known side effects that we can't manage. Well, in fact, there are two methods that come under this: marine cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosol. I can't speak for the marine cloud brightening, but I can speak for the stratospheric aerosol injection. I am very confident that it can be done, and if we do a lot of research very rapidly, we could start deploying the stuff in a year or two. But jolly strong amount of research needs to be done. I think everybody agrees we need better modeling, because the modelers haven't even captured this effect on weather extremes. As far as I can tell, it's not in the models.
Thanks, John.
So,
Look, what we'll do
yep,
is
okay,
I think
my lot.
that's a really
Thank you.
constructive input. I'd just like to say, I'd like to see a conference on the model of the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 that established the international economic institutions that have delivered financial stability largely over the last 70 years to deliver climate stability. And so research on those sorts of questions needs to be very well governed and needs that broad support. Now, Robert, you're welcome to make a brief comment, or we can move on to Mike McCracken.
I'll just say very briefly, I'm kind of very dubious about optimism. It always strikes me as being a sort of example of a triumph of hope over experience. And I'm always very aware of Dr. Pangloss from Candide. I think we need to keep our feet on the ground and be realistic. And the fact of the matter, my observation is that, yes, of course, it would be great to have a Bretton Woods type agreement, and all of these things can be done. Of course, they can be done. But where's it happening? Who's talking about it in the corridors of power? Where is there any sign, any evidence whatsoever of a significant shift in that direction?
Sure, there's none, but at least we're starting the conversation here, and I think that that's certainly grounds for optimism. And unless there are optimistic people who push the dial, then the pessimists and the ignorant will win the day. So let's move on to Mike. Mike.
Thank you. It's a very interesting discussion. I want to come back, Robert Tulip, to a comment you made that I think is actually at the crux of the problem. You basically said we could return and think into the scientific and capitalist thinking frame, and as if those are sort of similar. And it seems to me they're actually quite different, and we're not doing it right. So what the IPCC has done, it was set up as a scientific assessment. It picked up on the scientific decision-making framework, which tends to look at the centroid where it has highest confidence, and doesn't really look at the extremes because it can't predict, it can't say what they will be, how bad it will really be. Whereas the business framing, at least my understanding and working with a business person, basically says that the reason that society has been able to go forward is that they try and have resilience to the worst plausible outcome. The run on the bank, the 100-year flood, a whole bunch of things. They have tried to build resilience to the worst kind of conditions, so that most of the time society is doing pretty well. They're basically taking a risk framing rather than looking at the central value. The problem has been they're encouraged to do that. I mean, even Greta Thunberg sort of says, pay attention to the science. It would be much better if she were saying, pay attention to the risk. Pay attention to what's happening with these extremes that are occurring and with the extremes that can occur. The rate of them is increasing much more rapidly than the sort of seeming central value kind of things. And I think the big mistake that was made in setting up IPCC was giving the scientific community sort of a veto power over the summaries for policymakers. That those should have been done if there had been, and we went looking for ones, I think, but those should have been prepared by people who have a risk framing about it. Sort of the people in the insurance community or or others who say, we just can't have these short-term risks. So IPCC is talking about global average temperature, averaged over 10 years. It's a daily average value. I mean, they're just focused on the central average and not what's happening with the extremes. And so what a number of us are trying to do is get attention in some of the business community to say, you're not doing what you were taught to do and what you need to go back and do. You need to, if you're thinking about investments or other things, you look for for having that safety, that resilient, building resilience to extreme conditions. And I mean, Greta sort of says, you know, I don't want a 60% chance that the young generation is going to survive or something. No, she's exactly, I mean, she should be saying, I want a 99% chance. That's what everybody else has been having. We should be responding in order to be having the kind of resilience so we don't have all these frequent disasters or something. And so I think if you start taking a risk-based framing and we get people thinking about risk, maybe they'll be more accepting of the realization that there's a need to take on other things and try and pull the climate back to lower temperatures, and do that by some sort of intervention.
Those are really sound points, Mike. And I mentioned the problem of complacency, and as I see it, the complacency problem is shared across the IPCC and also with the business community, worse with the business community. Like, for example, I would like to see marine cloud brightening used to mitigate the risk of hurricane intensity in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. We just had an awful hurricane that's hit Vanuatu just off Australia. And what they were saying is that these Cat 5 hurricanes, cyclones, are now happening every year, where they used to happen every 20 years. And that's what people can't cope with. You know, it's just the constancy of the intensity of climate impacts. So thanks very much, Mike. Robert, do you have any response?
Hansen's only, you know, his shifting sort of Gaussian curves that he had for happen. So what was a 3 sigma event in the mid 20th century, by the one he used, is now occurring more than, so which is sort of a 1 in 1,000 kind of thing, is now occurring more than 10% of the time. That's what's happening with extremes. And that's what we really need to be looking at, because the coral don't sit there and take the 10-year running average of temperature when they decide to bleach. Or anything. I mean, it's the short term, and this averaging is a problem. And that means look at the risk, look at the extremes. And I think if we get people focused on that, maybe they'll realize it's real time to do something.
Yeah, so mitigating the risk of extreme weather requires albedo enhancement. Robert, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are all great ideas. I'm very supportive of all of this. My reservation is not, and never has been, the lack of ideas. It's all great, and we need to have this discussion, and we need to press these ideas forward. That's why I wrote to my member of parliament, because what else can I do? But one of the things that we need to be aware of is that time is running extraordinarily short. The climate system is a huge beast. It isn't going to get turned on a sixpence. It isn't going to get turned in 5 minutes. You know, there is immense inertia in this. And there's never been a time in history when the sort of change that we are talking about, actually on the ground, has cut just the engineering infrastructure, the degree of activity to make all this happen at sufficient scale has ever been done at this kind of speed. You know, this is not something that a market is ever going to deliver, because markets don't do things that quickly. They have no reason to. That's not what they're for. That's not what their intention is behind them. So, yes, all of this is really good stuff, but somehow it's got to be leveraged hugely and rapidly, and that's my concern. Just like comedy, it's all in the timing.
We'll move on to Ron Bayman.
Yes, sorry, getting my mute button up there. Thank you very much, Roberts. This is very, very stimulating and interesting conversation, and an important conversation. My major concern, and Robert C. and I have had some dialogue. Well, I've had the privilege of having some, direct personal communication with Robert C. on this. My major concern is I don't think it's the being captured by a broad philosophical perspective. I've encountered this in many previous cases. Many of you know I've been on the left for many years. I got kicked out of programs because I fought against the Althuserian Marxists, who later became postmodern Marxists. Who, the folks that sort of become extremely enamored by a particular perspective and then use these very abstract categories, and that kind of leads, unfortunately, of course, what I'm saying is I believe that Robert, to some extent, has been captured by this kind of systemic theory, that has been around for a long time, complex systems and, feedback loops and, chaotic systems and so forth. I mean, they are obviously very important, and the evolutionary notions that, the framework that he was talking about. I mean, that's Marx was the first progenitor of this, is the evolutionary theory of how capitalism is going to develop into, something better, and the new world will arise from the ashes of the old, because it's going to, and some Marxists took this very seriously. I mean, I think Marx himself was more of a polemic argument about, but anyway, I don't want to. So that's sort of my major concern here. In fact, I would urge Robert C. to take a page from your own thinking, that it cannot be that complex systems theory that you advocate is the end all and be all. It's that's part of what you're saying. So to just kind of write off hope because within that framework you perceive such a dire outcome is I think not a good way to proceed. My more sort of less abstract and general point here is that I think, for example, what John N. was saying, and some of us, and by the way, Robert, I really do appreciate, I mean, I think you are a very, insightful, brilliant thinker. And when you use it for practical purposes, like to write letters to your constituent or to analyze, Hanson's report and so forth, it's very effective. I mean, you hone in on key points in a way that's extremely helpful for our cause. So I don't mean to diminish, what you're doing. I just wish you would work on the more practical side and less on,
Ron,
working.
let's okay.
So,
thanks, Ron.
One other just the practical point is the short-term thing is eminently, I think, so, even within our system, even with the capitalists controlling everything in the world, all the problems we have, it is not a huge lift for us to just cool things and keep them cool while we work on them. So I think, that's where I think, a lot of the optimism, my optimism comes that we can get through this if we can solve the practical problem, the short-term problem that I think is much more solvable, as you point out, than the long-term problem.
Okay, let's hear from Robert. Chris.
Okay, well, I mean, let me just make an observation here. Some of you know that last week excuse me, in fact, I spent an hour talking to Tero Mustonen, who some of you may know is one of the indigenous peoples in the north of Finland. And he's an interesting character because he's also a lead author for the IPCC, a lead author on Working Group 2. And he meets John Kerry. He walks in these circles. So he's an indigenous people, but he understands the issues. Now, the thing that I have really found fascinating talking to him, and earlier today I finished transcribing my hour-long conversation with him from the recording and made some notes on the conversation. And the thing that really comes home to me is a fundamental point about what it is we're trying to preserve, what it is we're all trying to sort out. And critically, is everybody on side? And what emerged from this long conversation with Tero is that his perspective on behalf of the indigenous people is that what we are trying to preserve is probably not worth preserving, and they're not that interested in getting their hands dirty helping us do it, because they have got something that they consider to be much more important. So, you know, we need to bear in mind, you know, and the Sami people were the principal people that killed off David Keith's Scopex project. So these indigenous people, the small island states, and these folk do have quite considerable veto power. And these are the people that we've got to get on side. And, you know, I heard what Robert T was saying earlier on about all of the good reasons that albedo enhancement should appeal to indigenous people. Well, I'm hoping that in a few weeks' time, I'll be able to set up Tero to come and join us. And it'll be really interesting to see how effective we are in convincing him that we have a common interest in albedo enhancement. Because I can tell you this much, right now, he simply isn't interested. And he understands issues. You know, he's read Hansen's paper. He's read Lenton's stuff. And I mean, I sent him all that and we talked about that. He knows about the science, but he's not on the same side as us when it comes to these issues. So we need to be really careful not to imagine that our sense of what is right and proper is a unique sense of what's right and proper. And if we want to have everybody on side, then we have a challenge. If, on the other hand, we just want to treat them like collateral damage, then fine. You know, we've been doing that. I mean, he would argue, in fact, he does argue, that that's what's been happening through colonial history for some centuries. So, you know, more, you know, what the expression he used was same old, same old. These are complex issues.
Yep,
It's
look,
not about the science.
I think I'd like to follow up on Ron's comment about the philosophy of complex adaptive systems. But in the interest of time, we've got 15 minutes to go. What we'll do is we'll just hear from the remaining three, and we might have time for more if other people want to put their hands up. So first, Herb.
Thanks. So I'm going to just lay out a very brief, simplistic scenario, and I want to see, in particular, Robert C., if you would argue, which I assume you will, that it's inconsistent with adaptive systems theory. First, I just wanted to comment that I don't agree that nothing is happening. We've got some major establishment organizations that have embraced research, as we know. Council on Foreign Relations, American Meteorological Society, obviously the Center for Climate Repair, et cetera, the National Academy of Sciences. Also, you know, the Breakthrough Institute in Oakland, California, they wrote an article last year. They talked about the concept of quiet climate action, that in the US Congress, there have been a number of bills to advance certain aspects of climate, mostly having to do with carbon capture, that have been basically adopted with very little publicity, by bipartisan supports. And interestingly, and I haven't tracked it down, I haven't tried to yet, but somebody in Congress last year, as I think many of us know, put a provision in the legislation to establish this 5-year geoengineering research program. That was a congressional mandate that, you know, I never read a thing about, you know, so somebody was supporting it quietly beneath the scenes. So, and I think a lot more of that can happen. Obviously, as John Nissen said, you've got George Soros coming out for it, and you know, other I think the Overshoot Commission. So, you know, whether this happens fast enough in the right way, you know, legitimate questions, obviously. But given that context, and given the fact, as Ron said, and as I think we all know, the one huge advantage of cooling is you don't need 8 billion people to agree to it. I mean, you can't do emission reductions ultimately until every building that's burning something stops burning it. You know, every owner or renter in the whole fucking world has to stop, more or less. I mean, here you need a relatively small number of elite people, and you're right, it may be colonialism, but that's a huge advantage. Plus, you have the elite in terms of world power centers. So let's just say that Joe Biden, I mean, the budget that he announced today, you know, is a dramatic left wing, but I don't even want to say left or right. It's a bold budget. And if he gets reelected to a second term, let's say he does, he's 80 years old. He's not going to run again. He cares about his legacy. And his science advisor says to him, in the meantime, there's 2 years more of research and activism, the Silver Lining and all sorts of other groups. And his science advisor says, you got to do this. You got to sit down with China. And just as you said before, Robert, what has not happened, set aside the war and set aside the geopolitics, and in a very, cold-blooded survival mode, say, we've got to be doing this in parallel, you and us, and, you know, any other elite countries, powerful countries. In the meantime, groups like ours will be springing up all over the world to influence and get the facts out, and slowly or not so slowly. So is that a scenario? And so ultimately in 2026 or thereabouts, there is a joint US-China program to accelerate, all the research and field testing so that by 2030, we can be in the sky, or Stephen Salter's boats can be, going up and down the Atlantic, or Yatal's mirrors, or whatever combination needs to be done. Is that incompatible with your theory?
No, it's totally compatible. The issue here is, and the problem with this complex adaptive systems theory is that it's not predictive, because you can never know, except retrospectively, where you are in the adaptive cycle. So what tips you from conservation to collapse is an inadequate capacity to adapt. And of course, you don't know whether you've got an inadequate capacity to adapt until you have it. So it may well be that the concerns that I've got are the lack of evidence that I see, that maybe because there isn't any evidence, or the evidence, I'm just not seeing the evidence. Actually, maybe things will move faster. Maybe we are yet more flexible and more adaptive than I'm imagining, which is why we have to have this discussion, why we have to get these ideas out there, why I'm writing to my MP, because I'm not giving up. I'm just trying to be realistic that this is absolutely non-trivial, and we are absolutely in a really critical stage. And if we don't get this right in the next 2, 3, 4 years, then the danger increases exponentially. So we are at a very, very strange time in human history, but it fits perfectly with the theory. It's just that I don't know exactly where we are on that curve, and I hope that we're not where I think we are. I hope we're a bit earlier, and we are even still to react.
Well, I have some comments, but
Yeah, go ahead.
What I'll do is I'll invite Rebecca to. She's taken a hand down, but if Rebecca, in the interest of gender balance, of which we've had none so far, but Rebecca.
Thank you, everyone. I was just going to say thank you for a wonderful discussion, when I think there's never any doubt about the science of what we're saying, and the fact that there is hope, or whichever other noun you want to use. There is a way forward. What I would really like is for us to be putting ourselves in the other people's shoes. People like Greta, who are angry for good reason about the state the planet is in, and also the Sami. I've written a few active listening type questions, which I've shared only so far with Ron, and he encouraged me to send it to the HPAC steering circle, which I will do. But what I feel is we're very Western, and we're kind of saying what we think, and like the fact that we've got graphs that show where we are, and we've got solutions that can help us get through, and that we're making a distinction between the short and the long term. All of that is marvelous, and that's why I'm still here after 3 years after I first heard Robbie speaking at a student reunion, and my knowledge is increased from nothing to something now. But I would really like us to try and frame it all more from the point of view of the people who either don't understand, which is the great majority, or the people who are anti it. Now that's my daughter, so I've got to go. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rebecca. Let's hear from Jeff.
Yes, I have a question for Robert, Tulip, and others who think that refreezing the Arctic should be high priority for albedo enhancement. If if a certain amount of effort and money is spent for albedo enhancement in the tropics, it will have more than 10 times more watts sent to space than doing the same thing in the Arctic. So why put the effort in the Arctic?
Well, one reason is that Arctic amplification is causing a temperature rise 4 times the speed of the equator, and what the destabilization of Arctic amplification is a main cause of extreme weather. My sense is that what we're currently doing now is turning the poles from white to black, and we can turn them back to white. With my view is that the investment that's required to achieve that is is probably more feasible than work at the equator. Now, it may be that mirrors to enhance reflectivity at the equator will prove to be an equal thing, and that's why I call for an international climate authority that will be responsible for doing the scientific assessment. I'm just like, for example, I've said let's focus on Antarctica with marine cloud brightening, but people have come back and said, well, if we start with Hudson Bay and we get the government of Canada to deploy technology there, then we can make a start. So it's partly just on this practical question of where do you make a start, and where do you see the big wins and the feasible social tipping points, to use John Nissen's term. And so there's I think George Soros's advocacy for Arctic refreezing, and David King gives that a strong impetus. And so I take your point, Jeff. Now in the summer there's more insolation at the pole than at the equator, and so it's valuable to reflect the sunlight that's coming in and to stop the poles from melting. Jeff, any response on that?
I'm just not convinced that if you've got a certain amount of energy and money to spend on albedo enhancement, that it's better to do it any place other than the tropics. I would like to see more study and more data, but so far I'm not convinced.
Great. Good. Very good question. Thanks for raising it. Let's go. Robert.
Can I just add a bit here? This is not my field of expertise, and I suspect that Mike might have more to say on this. But my understanding is that it isn't just a case of doing it where it's most efficient, where you get the biggest bang for your buck, because where you do your albedo enhancement has impacts elsewhere on the planet. So, for example, if you were to do some serious albedo enhancement in the Arctic, my understanding is you do that in the summer, in the spring and the summer. You've also got to do some in the spring and in the other seasons in the Antarctic, in the south, because otherwise you produce some very undesirable climatic effects across the equator. So this is, again, an example of a complex system that needs to be very, very carefully tweaked, because you could easily do something really, really serious if you just kind of did one thing. Now, that may well apply if you just did it in the tropics. Maybe you have to do it in all 3 places, I don't know. But these are big questions that do need to be answered by research.
Thanks. Let's go to John McDonald. Unmute, please, John.
Look, I'm an architect and I like to cut to the chase on these sorts of questions as well. And I mean, Peter Wadhams has measured that the ice is melting from below. This seems to suggest that the currents, the warming currents, are doing more of the damage than the atmosphere over the Arctic. So logically it makes sense that we should tackle it with marine cloud brightening in the tropics, not only mitigating hurricanes, but looking at those inflows that are flying under the ice and causing most of the damage. So these are pretty important questions. Would it be better to do it this way than brightening the atmosphere over the Arctic? I mean, brighten the atmosphere in the place that cools those currents, perhaps. So Brian might have a comment on this. I think Stephen Salter's dropped off the call, but interested in any thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure, but it needs to be incremental. Like the thing is that we start off with modeling and with small scale field tests, and we find out what works best, and we assess the sort of side effects that Robert Chris has alluded to. My sense is that there's been a lot of exaggeration about side effects, and that the benefits are likely to vastly exceed any harms. And also that Stephen Salter has pointed out the ability for a global program of marine cloud brightening to be deployed using advanced computing power in order to work out where and when is the optimal place, and to open that discussion. Now, let's hear from Mike McCracken.
I was just going to say there is a really interesting recent paper out now as a preprint, I think, that does comparative efforts to try and keep the global temperature steady by putting in injections at low latitudes, mid latitudes, or high latitudes and things. So there are some papers that look at that. And then there was another paper, and I guess I could somehow send them around or something. There's another paper out of Colorado State that was very interesting, which showed that the main thing that you first see when you try and keep the climate stable as compared to the temperature going up is that you level out what is happening with the hydrologic cycle, which is very important. That is, the atmosphere can go up and down and have a lot of variability. It doesn't have much heat capacity. The hydrologic cycle has a lot of heat capacity and inertia in it. There's just much more energy involved in it. And so when you basically sort of stop putting more energy into the hydrologic cycle, it stops intensifying and going up pretty quickly. And given that that's one of the big impacts, it looks very interesting. It's a paper out of a study funded, as I understand, by DARPA, which its excuse for doing studies is we want to detect if some other country is doing studies. And so as a result, they do a whole bunch of studies, which is kind of interesting. So, but there's some very interesting papers getting done, which hasn't been the case. If you go back a few years ago, they were doing big changes to try and get big signal to noise. And nobody's going to go from CO2 doubling to 19th century or something. That's just a huge shock. But now they're starting to look at, let's try and keep it level, or let's not make much change and see what it can do. And you start to see some really interesting results. And they're putting it in different latitudes. And I do want to just address one more thing on this thing about this issue. Everybody says it's the SRM is all these big uncertainties. I think we need to turn that around on them. The models have done a remarkably good job at representing the change in temperature through the 19th and 20th centuries with a number of forcings like volcanoes and maybe solar variations and some other things, aerosols and stuff. They do remarkably well. And what we're trying to do with SRM is stay in that range that we know how things operate pretty well, as opposed to going up to 2.5 or 3 degrees where we have no idea exactly what the uncertainties are. I mean, we don't know where the tipping points are. We don't, all the models have been sort of underestimating what's been happening as we go along. And so it just seems to me crazy to let them get away with an argument saying it's more uncertain, that there are greater uncertainties with SRM than there are without SRM.
Now, this has been such a good conversation. We've reached our usual ending point. I'd like to propose that we continue for another 15 minutes if people are available. And I'd especially like to invite David Mitchell to comment in the light of his work on cirrus cloud thinning, if that's okay with others.
Sure, I'll just have to wing it here. So a lot of what's been holding up cirrus cloud thinning is this academic question about what ice formation process dominates in cirrus clouds. And one is heterogeneous nucleation. Most people, most scientists think that that's the dominant pathway. The other pathway is called homogeneous nucleation. And with a new Calypso satellite retrieval that we've developed over the last year and a half, we found a way to tease out which mechanism is contributing to cirrus clouds all around the world. And homogeneous nucleation, if I can find the table here, I think it was between 33 and 43%. Let's see, let me check this.
David, I really wanted to acknowledge that you're on the call and that cirrus cloud thinning, it's not a form of albedo enhancement, but it's a really important form of solar radiation management. And so over to you just briefly.
Okay, so I guess the bottom line is we can't do cirrus cloud thinning in the tropics with thunderstorms. We can do it outside the tropics. So we found that the radiative impact, or the cloud radiative effect that was estimated, is around 80% for homogeneously produced cirrus clouds, or homogeneous ice nucleation involved in the cirrus clouds. So that's good news if you want to use it to cool the climate. We ran it, a radiation transfer calculation in the Arctic in the middle of wintertime, so Arctic night. And the cooling, if you just have the cirrus cloud cooling, was about 5 watts per square meter. So pretty significant cooling. But if you put low clouds underneath the cirrus clouds, it wipes out the cooling effect. So, and even if you have just a tiny amount of low clouds, it still wipes it out. So it's very sensitive to that. But this radiation transfer calculation, it's based on just a snapshot of like a split second in time, you might say. It doesn't consider the cloud lifetime. So cirrus cloud thinning has two impacts. One is just the optical depth impact. You make the optical thickness of the cloud less and more radiation escapes to outer space. The other is the cloud lifetime, which controls the cloud fraction. So we don't know about that component of it yet. We have to put it in a climate model, run the climate model and find out. So there's reasons for optimism. There's a lot of caveats involved we don't know about, like low clouds, what effect those.
Thanks for sharing that, David. What we'll do, I suggest, is we'll wrap up and we'll invite Robert and myself to just make any concluding comments on the overall discussion. So Robert first.
Yeah, this is a superb discussion. I remain very skeptical about our prospects of resolving this, of an orderly transition from where we are today to where we will be in 50 or 100 years' time. I don't personally regard that as being too much of a disaster, but I think that we are in for some shocks, and I sincerely hope that I'm wrong. And we need to keep this discourse, this discussion, letters to our public representatives, papers, and all the rest of the stuff that everybody's doing. We need to keep that going, because whilst I place a great deal of store in complex adaptive systems theory to explain the direction of travel, as I said, it's not a predictive theory. It explains how things happen, how things work, and why things are challenging. But it isn't determining it, and there is yet the prospect that we could rescue this situation if some of these things change. But where's the evidence? And just bear in mind that the change that's required is enormous in a very short time, and that to me is, and we ignore that at our peril. And at some point, it might be prudent to say, look, guys, we are close to giving up here, and actually doing that might be a sufficient wake-up call to the rest of the community to say, oh my God, these guys have been working so hard on trying to save this. They've now given up. Maybe it really is as bad as they're saying it is. Who knows? It's a strange world we live in.
So my paper was on moral perspectives on climate policy, and essentially it's a provocative claim to say that the vast bulk of the ethical debate that we see around climate policy suggests that geoengineering is a wrong path, whereas I'm saying that the moral argument suggests that we really need to implement and deploy geoengineering, and not just to test it, but that I do think that there's a predictive capacity within complex adaptive systems, which is that if you look at, if you make an intervention, then that will nudge the system in a direction. And my sense is that brightening the planet will nudge our planetary system, our complex adaptive planetary system, away from the precipice that we're currently facing. And so the decisive thing is thinking. It's about a new form of global thinking that that really it's in the framework of paradigm shift, and recognizing that there's a whole series of debates that that flow into this and that need to be respected and integrated and taken into account, but that it is entirely possible to for humans to have the adaptive capacity to change our thinking, to evolve. Essentially, it's not a physical mutation; it's a mimetic mutation. It's about changing our culture, changing our minds, recognizing that we inhabit a global environment that's incredibly fragile, incredibly sensitive, incredibly beautiful, and that we are the stewards of our planet, and that we must exercise responsible stewardship in order for humanity and the whole biosphere to continue to flourish. So I'll leave that as a final comment, and we'll close the meeting at that point, and I'll invite the
Robert?
steering. Yes.
I just wanted to make
yes, Herb.
wanted to make
we
a
all-
last announcement, if I could.
Please.
Yeah, I sent this out on a note, but I just want to reiterate that our next meeting on the 23rd, we're going to have Zeke Housefather. I think I'm pronouncing the name right. I'm not exactly sure. Who's as broad-based a climate scientist as I've come across. He's written about committed warming, which is an issue that we've discussed in emails. He's working for a private company right now on maximizing CDR. He's written for Carbon Brief, summarizing IPCC meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it may be the first sort of mainstream climate scientist that we've had. So I think it'll be an extra special opportunity to engage in a conversation with him. So I hope you can all make it. And my thanks, I'll turn it back to you, Robert, but just want to give my thanks to both of the Roberts. Stimulating as I expected, no firm answers as I expected, and no surprise there. And back to you, Robert.
Great, thanks, Herb, and we look forward to meeting with Zeke next week, and then hopefully with David Keith 2 weeks after that. That'll be really valuable to have an exchange with David and his leading work at Harvard University. So thanks everyone for attending, and I'll put the recording of this up on YouTube and circulate it, and look forward to continuing our conversations.
Steering circle, stay on if you can.
And Robert, Chris, if you'd like to join us for, oh no, he's gone. That's good. Okay.
Well done, Rob.
Yep.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Great job.
That was great.
Really raised a lot of issues. We don't usually talk about big picture things like this.
Well, it's a good sign.
Well, there's,
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much to, everything touches on everything else. There's so much to grapple with that, you know, you almost feel like we should lock ourselves in a room somewhere for 24 hours with, you know, lots of libations and a beach in the back and just talk this out, you know.
Yep. Look, I'll have to go soon. I'd be just in terms of debrief. I'd be eager to hear brief comments from Suzanne and Julia and Brian.
I think it's a good sign. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I think we should have more conversations of this nature. It really stimulates a lot of thinking. So I had a lot of things that I wanted to say, but you know, there were so many signups, I didn't want to cut other people short. So to be continued, I hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's a good sign for the organization when there's so much activity. It's bringing in new people. It's you know, stimulating new thinking.
Yeah, you should speak up next time.
Yeah, sure.
You got to be like, yeah, or get it in the chat if you have thoughts.
Right.
Yeah, we would. I would like to hear your opinions on these things. Speaking personally, anyway.
And also, it's valuable for people to respond when the ideas are fresh. Julia?
I was just going to add, first of all, thank you for your presentation as well. And I think that it would be really interesting to see if there were more possibilities for two people to have a conversation like this. I think that would be a fun additional way, an engaging way to have these presentations.
Yeah, does that mean like an interviewer and an interviewee, perhaps? Is that like what you're thinking about?
That sounds great. I was thinking more like perhaps two people that don't agree. But I think both. I think that having a diverse program is really exciting.
I think all we need to do is find out whether Greta can join David Keith on April 4th.
Yeah, that's the thing. And
of-
gotta have a
yes.
civilized discussion.
And
So my
get a larger
thinking-
Zoom license, because we'd have about 12,000 people on.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it'd be great for publicity. My thinking as I was going along is I'm hearing the two Roberts and going, okay, what does this mean for how we proceed and communicate externally about these issues, and what can we draw from these philosophies? I buy in a little bit to what I call Robert Chris's crisis theory, because most of the decision making that I've been involved in has been stimulated by a crisis, to which people, well, politicians in particularly, ultimately respond. But even when a crisis could have been predicted. So, you know, having a conversation between two opposing views and learning from it about how do you communicate with people that have opposing views or find common ground among them. So it's sort of what do we do with this information? Since you mentioned Greta, I did buy her book in an audio, and so I expected not to be happy with it. And I actually am quite happy with it because, for a couple of reasons, because it crosses a wide span of people that disagree with us, each of whom expresses their opinions and their perspective on the climate thing. But the other thing is, if you step back from the theme there, they acknowledge that what we're doing is not working. And then they recommend each of them, depending on what category they're talking about, recommend sort of their solution to the problem. But, you know, it really comes down to, you know, people need to change their value systems and their behaviors. And, you know, they have some specifics about reporting real emissions and, you know, how you audit these things and report them. But taking what they've said and using it to formulate what our conversation would be with people who believe in that way, but using what they've already said, which is, this is not working, this is not working, and then figure out how to move the, the program, the agenda forward in terms of, if we can all agree that what's happening is not working, then it opens a discussion of what solutions can we pursue within the time frame that we have to pursue it. And they seem to be happy with a longer time frame, which I think is a big mistake.
Yeah, Greta's book is good, I think, for stimulating our thought process in how we're going to entrain and enlist the people in that cohort, because there are flaws in Greta's reasoning, and by maybe our thinking through those, we can appeal at the end of the day to the common interests we all have in having a healthy climate in the future. So maybe if we don't have Greta, we could actually debate her book and actually have some stimulating conversation with the reading assignment, and everybody, hey, in a week, we're gonna talk about Greta's book and what we can do about it.
Maybe in 2 months, Brian, not in a
Okay.
week.
That's fine. I was being metaphorical here. Yeah. But give people a month to read it and then say, hey, we're gonna talk about, all right, how would we enlist 1,000 Gretas, given this framework, right? In other words, let's use their her context. There's a lot of good things in the book. I've listened to it as well. Yeah.
And I recommended it to other people because I think it's the language is an example of how to communicate the issue to people that aren't as invested as we are in the details. It's very consumer friendly in that respect. And maybe there's an author in there some way where, if anybody knows anybody among the authors that would be willing to come, engage with us.
Yeah,
with
I think
with a very friendly invitation.
Yeah, and some of the reasoning, I think there's a visceral dislike for centralized geoengineering solutions, and a lot of Greta's objection is against what I want to call conquest and capitalism, and of course, a lot of our institutions, private and public, still have a conquest and capitalism mindset. So we've got to address that challenge. And prescribing a solution from on high may be a problem. And we've had some interesting conversations with the ETC group and others on how to address that in a better governance approach.
Well, her accountability, statements are right on. The sort of the emissions calculations and what's included and excluded. There's a lot of positives we could draw from what she's saying. So
now I got to go, but I'd just be interested to hear just a couple of final comments, maybe from Ron and then also from Mike.
Yeah, because speaking of pieces, it's a very short piece and we should all look at it. I think it's really good.
Which one?
Mike wrote a piece for a representative. Mike, you're muted. For their representative. Herb and Mike worked on this, and well, whatever. Mike can explain it.
Okay.
Well, I think the last time we were talking, there were a couple of homework assignments that we were going to try, and so I put one out. I didn't have everybody's name and address, so but Herb or Ron can put it around, or Susan. But but I've realized in drafting a letter, for example, that Congress might send asking questions of the administration, that I hadn't read what the language is that they did in establishing the NOAA 5-year program. Maybe you have that, Herb, or something like that, and could send it around, or somebody has it.
I don't. I can see if I can find it.
But it would be nice to know. But I was trying to do a sort of push our perspective by asking the administration questions and seeing if we could get the congressman to send something. So it was just an idea. It'd be nice to have some reactions. It's a way to try and get perspectives out of the administration, and sending letters to specific people. I should have had John Kerry on the list as well, since it asks a policy question. and send him a letter. And if it comes from Representative Raskin's office, I think, with a couple of others, I think it might get some sort of response. I mean, they can't ignore it if they want, but I don't think they would. But I don't know. Maybe Suzanne, you have more experience with that and how to put together a letter. And,
No, I mean, I think sending the letter in it is good. I think having more than one person, if we can find some of the other climate, activist kind of people that would sign it, I think it's good, and I look forward to reviewing it. I have the other task in that, and that was to rewrite the resolution. And I first thought that, and I apologize for being late on that. I thought I could rewrite a lot of what apparently had been written by Peter Fikowski. And I'll send a longer note around to the steering circle when I have it done. But as it turns out, his stuff was so oriented to supporting his philosophy and his approach that broadening it required an entire rewrite. So I'm trying to confine it to a statement of facts and nothing but the facts. And then with a posit of a commitment to pursuing, a wider portfolio of solutions.
Before we get too much into other things, can we just defer this conversation to the steering circle next week?
And I'll have the thing out by then.
And so I'll just close up unless there's anything burning that anyone wants to add.
No,
Right.
hopefully, Mike, you'll be able to join us, I don't know, at the steering circle next week. If not, anyway, you and I can talk offline. Thanks again, Robert, for all your work on this.
Yeah, great job.
Question,
Really
does
great job.
anyone have contact information for David Schwartz?
I do. I have been in battle with David Schwartz before.
Oh, okay, good. I'll email you offline then. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.